I once hung out with this shit group of kids, and they were just such shit. This to say, I made some mistakes, like breaking into this one guy's car, like stealing the stereo out of that car. I was young, and I didn't steal the stereo because I wanted the stereo. I stole it, rather, because I wanted the guy. This to say, I just wanted something the guy owned. This more to say that nothing else mattered in that moment except this thing the guy owned, this thing that I now know was not the guy. Anyway, there was nothing else in the car. Had there been a jacket, I would have stolen it. Had anything else jarred loose, a mirror, an ashtray, I would have stolen that too. But the stereo was the only thing I could snap out of its hole. And so there I was, drunk and standing on the sidewalk at 2 a.m., the bar closing, the drunk stumbling out, holding a car stereo with both hands, a kind of person I didn't even know I could be, and my friend said, run. This to say, I made a mistake. Not because I got caught, because I did not get caught. Because no one ever once got caught. Because this was Baltimore, and if you know the place, you know what I mean. If you know the place, you're likely from there. I mean, you're likely still there, which I no longer am. Which doesn't mean I figured it out. It only means a window appeared, and I went through the window before it disappeared. Metaphorically, I mean. But it's not time for anything deep. We're just talking about this mistake I made, how I can't make myself feel better. Because I'm awake and thinking the thoughts I think at 4 a.m., me, some guy, and it's always the same. Me, some guy, and we're lying around a bed like kids. Then one thing, another, his hands on my face, his face near my face, and just before it all starts up, I'm yanking a stereo out from its hole. I'm backing out ass first from the car. My friends are screaming, run. To say I shouldn't have stolen, but I've fallen hard for the guy whose stereo it was. And when I fall hard, I fall like the proverbial ton of whatever. And by fall, I mean I splinter everything around me. Another might call it apocalyptic. By another, I might mean the guy himself, the victim I mean, the guy headed away from me fast. He might use the word apocalyptic when cracks form in the asphalt, when windows shatter, when women cover their daughters' eyes, when he floats upward to heaven. I'm not being melodramatic. You've never been there to see it. And this time, like every time, the entire world had splintered. And because he'd been all night in the bar talking to some girl, I was splintering within this splintered world. It was very complex, this strategy, I mean. Like if he stood there, I stood here. If he looked at me, I looked away. And on and on and on. God. It was summer, and it was 100 degrees. This is not an excuse, but I'm just saying. It was 100 degrees, and my friend said, run, and we all ran up the street to my car, all of us too drunk to drive. And 6 of us kids squeezed into the car, 2 up front, 4 in back. And somehow I ended up in the back, even though it was my car. Somehow I ended up sitting on some guy's lap, the stereo, on top of mine. And somehow one of the guys ended up in the driver's seat, and he started the car and drove closer to the car I stole the stereo from, and we sat there. And the radio, meaning the piece of shit radio in my car, was playing something from that summer, and the kids up front were singing. And there I was, in the back of my car, some guy I didn't like, gripping my hips. I didn't know then what we were waiting for, sitting there outside the bar. We were waiting for the guy whose stereo I stole to walk out. We were waiting for the guy whose stereo I stole to get into his car and see that his stereo was gone. But then what? I mean, what were we going to do about it? That was the thing. I had the stereo, but now what? We'd hooked up, me and the guy whose stereo I stole, in the front of his car the week before I stole the stereo, and the week before that. And the liquor those nights was doing its thing. The stereo was doing its. And the guy did this thing those nights where he tilted his head too far to one side when he moved in toward me. There was something about this, nothing new. That brilliant spinning in one's gut that no one knows how to describe. that everything inside inching up, and this is why I wanted him. And by wanted, I mean I wanted to own him completely. I wasn't done. I knew that stealing a stereo was not the way to own a guy. I knew that the way to own a guy was to push something down, push something else out. I know that the way to own a guy still years later is this. Like recently, there was this incident. There was this guy whose car I scraped by mistake with my car. It was raining that day, a downpour, and the guy whose car I scraped by mistake was big and standing on the sidewalk, holding his sagging bags of groceries. He was waiting for me to move my car so that he could get into his. I mean, I'd parked so close he couldn't get into his car, and he was waiting in the downpour, burdened with his sagging bags, annoyed. And when I backed up my car, one hand up, giving the obligatory wave, the obligatory thanks for waiting, I scraped his car with my side mirror because of my shit parking job, and I heard it scrape, even through the sound of the radio, even through the rain and the windshield wipers squeak. And before I shut off the car, and before the rain refilled the windshield, I saw the guy drop his bags of groceries to the wet ground and smack his forehead with both hands. I knew I had a choice to make, and I knew the right choice was to get out of the car. And I knew I had another choice to make, and I knew the right choice was to be a guy. As the rain refilled the windshield, I knew I had to open the door. And as I opened the door, I heard first the downpour, then heard the guy calling me certain names reserved for women, certain names I'd been called before and would be called again, certain names I'd eventually later, not too much later, call others. And as I stepped out of the car, it was suddenly some very small thing, by which I mean I was suddenly a woman to this guy, absorbing these names reserved for women, standing there in the downpour, reduced to something snail small and just as tightly coiled. I wanted to be a guy. I wanted to be a certain type of guy. But instead I said, stop yelling at me. And he said, stop being a fucking whore. And what does one say to that? I wanted to say a lot of things. I wanted to say, is that the best you can do? Because it was raining and we were standing in it and it didn't look like it would stop. And his groceries might have slid at any point from the bottoms of their sagging bags. The world could have come, is what I mean, at any point to the standstill we've been waiting for. It would have been apocalyptic. And this would have been his finale, whore. But the point is not this. The point is I wanted to be a guy, by which I mean I wanted to get up in his face. I'm not talking about anything deep. I'm talking about a generic performance of guy. I'm talking about strapping on the proverbial pair. But I never had to, because there was a second guy walking down the sidewalk, and this is the point. This second guy was walking down the sidewalk, and the second guy had seen the whole thing, had seen me scrape this first guy's car, had seen the first guy smack his head and yell at me, and the second guy walked up to the first guy and called the first guy an asshole. And the second guy got up in the first guy's face and told the first guy to get back into his car, said there wasn't even a scratch, said I'll call the cops if you do not get the fuck back into your car right now. And the second guy asked me if I was okay. And the second guy called me certain names reserved for women, certain other names I'd been called before and would be called again. It was then I became some sweet thing. It was then I pushed something down, pushed something else out. It was then I knew I owned the situation, meaning I knew I now owned both guys. It's not something I want to explain. If you've got the parts, you understand. As for the rest of you, and I'll stop.
Hello. What a nice crowd. This is lovely. Thanks for coming. There are so many people here from all parts of my life, some of whom I've actually previously only known on Twitter, and it's really always very reassuring when somebody steps out of their avatar and turns out to be a real person. So thank you very much for coming. I'm going to read from the beginning of the story tonight. I won't be able to read the whole story, so I thought I would just tell you that it is about a middle-aged woman who lives with her elderly father. She cares for him somewhat reluctantly. They're bound together. It's the usual mix of love, resentment, tragedy, things said and not said. And she has recently become obsessed with driving well. So, the essentials of acceleration. I am a good driver, and by this I don't just mean safe. Like a good runner who doesn't waste motion in her stride, I maneuver my car with dexterity and precision. It is off. Oh. Okay. All right. A good driver, but perhaps not a good reader. The essentials of acceleration. I am a good driver, and by this I don't just mean safe. Like a good runner who doesn't waste motion in her stride, I maneuver my car with dexterity and precision. I merge smoothly and without braking. In 3 moves, I can parallel park on either side of the street. One of my friends is a mechanic at the corner garage. He respects my studious approach to the art of driving, and I admire his work. He's honest and his hours are reliable, unlike the dry cleaner up the street, who repeatedly closes at 10 to 7 and will not open the door even if you point out the time. Leo, the mechanic, is Mexican. His family also owns Guadalajara across the street, where I occasionally have a burrito. I am not married and I haven't traveled much, though I would like to. After college, I drove across the country with a friend, but that was 20 years ago. I went to Copenhagen as a teenager because my mother wanted to see it at Christmas. Mexico intrigues me now that I'm friends with Leo. It would be interesting to see his home. And by home, I don't mean his home isn't America. I assure you I understand this, though my father does not. Our neighbors assume that because I live in a house with my father, we are a close family. I'm 41, he is 91, and I am his only child. He built the house the year he was 50, the year I was born, his only act of practical construction in an otherwise wholly intellectual life. He's an English professor at the university, emeritus now, though they humor him with a little closet of an office he still goes to on Wednesdays. Everyone knows my father. He leaves flowers, roses or peonies typically, on our neighbors' doorsteps. For this, he saves plastic gallon milk jugs to use as vases. It takes him an exceptionally long time to finish a gallon of milk, so to supplement his stock, he pulls containers from the bins at the recycling center. He cuts off the tops of the jugs, fills them with water, sticks in the flowers from his garden, and sets out, sloshing water everywhere, down his beige pants, onto his white shoes. I asked him once why he couldn't just use jars. Jars are easier, I pointed out, smaller, and between the two of us we might generate enough so he wouldn't have to collect them from the recycling center. This was his answer. Holly, I'm sorry the Lord didn't give you a husband and children, but if he had, what you would know is folks on our street don't want a glass vase on the doorstep. A small child would knock it over, the glass would break, and the child might get hurt. I try to be neighborly. I am quiet and neat. I don't keep wind chimes, for example, because some consider them noise pollution. I rake my leaves on time. I mulch around my trees and shrubs. I have never left the Christmas wreath up past the first of the year or a pumpkin out past Thanksgiving. But I don't wish to be treated as good and lucky simply because I have an older father. I know he keeps the neighbors, mostly women at home with their babies, talking for long periods of time. I know every conversation, no matter how it begins, finds its way back to World War II or growing tomatoes. He must tire people with his stories about who used to live in their houses 60 years ago in the Negro part of town. Everyone seems interested at first, but how many times can you pretend to be impressed that Mrs. Prophet raised 9 children in the 2-bedroom bungalow you consider a starter home and plan to live in only until you have a second child and move across town to the bigger houses and better schools? I suppose people like my father out of some sense that it is right to honor the past. No one says Negro anymore, but no one tries to grow a ripe tomato from seed by the 4th of July anymore either. His age earns him the right to surprise people with his vocabulary and hobbies, while their babies nap or idle in strollers or tear about the lawn. Like an old cat who drools, he is forgiven. He's ending his life on Thomas Lane, they're starting theirs. If they notice this framing, they think it poignant, but not for 1 second do they think they might end their lives here too. My mother insisted I learn to drive on a manual transmission. There was a class in my high school, half a semester of driving split with half a semester of health, but she disdained the idea of my learning to drive in school, and the school cars were automatic. So I took an art class and drove with her in the evenings that fall. Every night for a week we circled the block. When I could do this without stalling or making any mistakes, she let me go farther. We listened to the radio, oldie stations my father disliked. She would bring 2 cans of soda, though I wasn't allowed to open mine until the lesson was finished. I drove while she sipped happily, marking the rhythm of the songs with her hand on the door and a little bounce in her chin. Now when I tell Leo over my Monday burrito that my mother taught me to drive, he says, "No." What do you mean, no? It's a father's job. In all other ways, my parents had very traditional roles, but my mother was a good driver. Leo seemed amused. Your father is not? I didn't know how to answer that question, so I just said again that it was my mother who taught me to drive. My neighbor stopped by yesterday. When I answered the door, she asked for Mr. Levering. I told her my father answers his own door, the one on the north side of the house. She frowned, but turned and left the porch. A few minutes later, she knocked again. There's no answer. I waited, wondering what she wanted me to do. Could you give him this? She handed me a small pink envelope. I started to say his door had a mail slot, but stopped. I'm aware of sometimes going too far. I notice his car's in the drive. She glanced up and down the street, but I don't see him outside. My neighbor is pregnant and has 2 other children under the age of 3. She has an overgrown yard, a gas-guzzling car, and a workaholic husband, and she has time to worry about my father. Does this make her a better person? I suspect she shakes her head over dinner on the rare nights when her husband is home and says, "I don't understand Holly Levering. Why doesn't she look after her father better?" I took the note from her and followed her down the front steps, then turned the corner of the house and aimed the note through my father's mail slot. When I stood up, I saw her watching me from the street. I smiled and waved. If being a friend and being a neighbor are the same thing, why do we have 2 different words? A few of the neighbors are new, and by that I mean they've been here for 5 to 10 years. But a couple have lived in the street longer than that, and not one of them has ever asked about my mother. Maybe they think she's living somewhere else? Tell me, when do you work into a conversation that your mother died in a car crash? Somewhere between bringing over the first pie or housewarming gift and the 9th or 10th Christmas without so much as an invitation for a holiday drink? Am I supposed to blurt out the information for their benefit, to explain my eccentricities? Maybe I should write it out on a laminated sheet and clip it to our front hedge. Yes, let's have laminated sheets up and down the street announcing all our personal disasters and resentments. That would be helpful, perhaps even neighborly. Leo says the formula for getting through the week in a small town and a small job is rhythm and routine, and I think he's on to something. My routine includes a burrito twice a week, once on Monday after work by myself, and again on Wednesday with my father after he gets home from his office at the university. Leo calls my father the professor, and my father calls Leo nothing after I told him the Mexican was not appropriate. The chef, my father asked? He's not though, he's a mechanic. He's just a server here sometimes. Now who's judging, my father said. There is absolutely nothing to recommend Guadalajara or over any other Mexican restaurant in town except that I know and like Leo. It is small and has a view of a parking lot, though most places in Charlottesville do. It is also within walking distance of the house, and it's nice to know I can occasionally enjoy a beer or 2 with my dinner and not have to worry about the drive home. How are you, Professor? Leo asks and puts in the order for the pork chalupas he likes. Fine, sir, my father says with a small bow. They feign a courtliness I don't understand. I asked Leo about it once and he just smiled. I asked my father if he'd gotten the pregnant neighbor's letter. She has a name, he said, Janine. They all do, I presume. Do you think she knows mine? My father continued as if he hadn't heard me. And the children are Annabelle and Henry. We ate for a few minutes. For an old man, my father eats neatly, which is a blessing. What was it about, I asked. The flowers. The envelope was in his pocket, and he showed it to me, a thank you note for one of his bouquets, scrawled by Annabelle. The food arrived, and I ordered a second beer. At the end of our meal, my father said he'd like to walk home. "What about your car?" I asked. "I'll get it tomorrow." Sometimes I'm surprised we can talk about cars so casually. "Dad, you won't want to walk up here tomorrow. I'll drive it for you." "Sure I will." But I drove it home for him, and I shouldn't have, because I'd had the 2 beers. I am the neighbor you don't know, the neighbor who doesn't do anything wrong, but for some reason you just don't like her very much. Maybe it's the way she treats her elderly father. You think she could be nicer. You've lived down the street 10, 15 years and know her no better than you did the day you moved in. You've asked her for favors, bring in the mail while we're away, water the garden, but she's never asked you for a favor in return. Maybe you have a smattering of memories, mostly visual, watching her haul her Christmas tree home, shovel her car out of the snow, drive a wreath of pink roses somewhere every spring. Is it every spring? No, more often than that, surely, but you can't quite remember. Neighbor must be one of the most flexible words in the language, and by that I mean you can say, "She's my neighbor," and people will think you mean she's your friend. But if something goes wrong, you can say, "Oh, I don't really know her, she's just my neighbor," and everyone still knows what you mean. Janine told the police she didn't think I had a drinking problem. Then again, she said, "I don't really know her, she's just my neighbor." A witness said the boy was never really all that close to the car. In the paper it became, "Daughter transporting mother's roadside memorial has traffic accident," which is strange for 2 reasons. First, there was no traffic. I missed the boy and hit the parked silver Lexus of the wealthy college student living in the house her parents bought her. It was either the Lexus or Mr. Braden's prize yellow butterfly bush, and I like him better. No other cars were involved, and the boy was unhurt. Second, I wasn't transporting the wreath. I didn't even know it was in the trunk. I was supposed to pick it up in the morning. I was going too fast, however, that much is true. The 2 beers and a small dinner meant my judgment was impaired, no question, though my blood alcohol level was not over the legal limit. The officer was young and apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said. "I have to ticket you, but I don't really think you're a threat." I thanked him and thought it best to say nothing more. I wasn't sure he was right. Sometimes I think I know a few big things about me and my family more than I know one single true sentence. Most of you know that today is the publication day of this close, but Susan's book is also very new. It came out in January, right? Oh no. So we're really, we both have new books out, and I want to thank the Center for Fiction for hosting this event. It's one of my favorite venues in the city. I sometimes just can't believe there's a whole building in the city that is for the purpose of furthering the cause of fiction in the world. And whenever I think of that, it makes me happy. And I'd also like to thank Grey Wolf Press. This is my 2nd book with them, and I have benefited so much from their wisdom and definitely editing, and really the passion with which they publish all of their authors. It's really something to behold in this world of publishing, and I'm very grateful. So thank you. Thanks very much.